Well, that was an inspiring talk from a young lady who is wise beyond her years. So thank you, Jess. It's interesting, some of the things she said, isn't it? That about talking about having the courage to face and admit your issues and to speak out. And I'd like to praise Jess's courage, as someone's already said, for standing up here today and talking about her experience. That couldn't have been an easy thing to do. It was interesting to hear about the impact on family. I think we forget that sometimes, about the impact these things have. And one of the things that Jess said, now I'm a veteran, I'm also from a forces family, and I remember growing up in a forces family, and one of the things Jess just said, which really sort of hit a note with me, was about mum being the glue. And I think that is so much the case in so many forces families. It's the spouses that hold it all together when it's all going horribly Pete Tong, and I think it's good to remember that. So thank you for reminding us, Jess. Okay, I'm going to hand you over now to a gentleman I've had the pleasure of working with for quite a few years. We've been very fortunate in Dorset over recent years to have the resources to support the armed forces community in Dorset with regards to health and well-being. We've had an NHS health and well-being team, and that's been headed up by our next speaker, Mr. Andy Gritt, MBE. And Andy's now going to talk to us about the new South West High Intensity Service under Op Courage. And Andy's been given the task of bringing that to fruition. So he'll tell you more about that. But I think also along the way, talk about a bit about his journey and how he got to doing what he's doing now. So over to you, boss.
My journey? God. Thank you, Kev. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real privilege to be able to stand before you today, and I feel really humbled by listening to the experience that Jess has been through. It feels quite difficult to follow such a passionate and interesting journey. I'll do my best. I do want to talk to you about Op Courage. So Op Courage is a commitment to our armed forces. Op Courage was touted by, obviously by Johnny Mercer when he was Defence Minister. And it's a promise to our veteran community that we will provide them with the support that they need on leaving the forces and on trying to make new lives in Civvy Street. We all talk about the Armed Forces Covenant, and I've been privileged to work alongside Kev for the last few years as our Covenant officer. And I think it's really important to recognise what the Armed Forces Covenant actually means. And it's a promise that our nation makes to look after members of the armed forces and their families, and that we provide services to support them in their need. So just a little bit of background about the challenges we face in actually doing this. As you can see, we recognise that there's an estimated 10 million members of the armed forces community, veterans, in the UK. About 24,000 personnel leave the forces each year. As you can see from the numbers, we're talking about significant numbers here. The NHS has been responsible since 1948 for the care and support of veterans and their families. But I have to say that the nuance of being a member of a service family is not well understood by the NHS. I'm employed by the NHS. I'm also a veteran, as are most of my team. So just a quick bit about what it's like to leave, and in terms of transitioning out from the military. It is quite difficult for a number of people that have given their lives, the vast majority of their working lives, to the military to make that transition. And as Ian Duffy was saying in his talk about the physical stuff, moving into Civvy Street's pretty scary. It can be a really daunting prospect for people. You know, you've had pretty much everything done for you whilst you've been serving. Doctors, dentists, etc., etc. Finding a house, finding a new job, all that kind of thing can be really difficult. Losing your status, losing your peer group, losing your friends. Getting used to the humour and recognising that perhaps civilians don't share that same gallows humour is often quite difficult. I know I got into a lot of trouble when I first left with some of the statements, like telling your secretary to wind her neck in doesn't go down very well, believe you me. So all of that stuff, that plays upon us in that transition period. And don't get me wrong, the vast majority make the transition from military service into civvy without any problems at all. But there are some that do struggle significantly. So unsuccessful transitions, we recognize that there are difficulties. There's difficulties with homelessness, there's difficulties with alcohol misuse, there's difficulties with debt. These are all kind of things that occur within the difficult transitions, that people that don't make those transitions well. This one I just want to put up because I think it's quite a significant slide. In the age group 16 to 64, veterans are much more likely to suffer the consequences of a number of issues, particularly physical issues, than their colleagues, than their counterparts in civilian street. So rates of depression, as you can see there within the veteran population, are almost twice that which you find in a similar age group of the civilian population. We can probably, most of us that are kind of a bit long in the tooth, can probably relate to the other stuff here, back problems and problems with arms and legs, and my knees are shot to hell. Problems with arms, heart problems. Now, heart problems is a really interesting one because that's significantly higher than you see within the civilian population. And also diabetes. And I got a theory about diabetes. Diabetes at twice the rate. High-calorie diets, lots of alcohol, lots of fizz. What goes when you leave? The fizz. So I think, anecdotally, rates of diabetes quite high. PTSD, interestingly, rates of PTSD only 1% above that which you would see within the civilian population. But it's the complexity of that PTSD that's different. And as Jess said, the complexity of what goes alongside that for families is different. Interestingly, spousal trauma of combat veterans, there's not very much research around that, but some of the stuff that I've read recently would suggest that's as high as about 38% of spouses that have some kind of trauma-related problems by being within that kind of family unit. I don't know the figures for children. I think that would be really interesting to look at. Just a very quick one. Employment difficulties with leaving the forces. As you can see there, 1 in 4 working-age members of the ex-service community have unpaid caring responsibilities for spouses or children, and a number of significant unemployment, 60% versus 73% of the general population. So significant, again, differences between the two. Okay, that's a bit of the background. As I said, most people make the transition without any problems whatsoever, but for a few, there are difficulties that they incur. We, here in the Southwest, have developed a partnership with Combat Stress. Combat Stress are operating an element of the service. We're both kind of organisations that are used to delivering services. This is all under the umbrella of Op Courage. So we have clear accountability. We're also linked in with a number of charities and working closely with a number of charities. Jess mentioned a couple that we work with, and also with the work that Kevin's now doing regionally as our covenant officer. We have a wider reach in terms of developing services. So we're looking to develop that and focus on developing a wide network so that we can actually provide a level of service to people that are in crisis. Don't worry about this slide too much. It's quite a complicated slide, but it just shows you the complexity of what we're dealing with. We put the member of the armed forces community, and the member of the armed forces community, when I talk about that, I'm not just talking about veterans. The point of the service is that it's not just for that person that served. It's for their family members and their children as well, because we need to recognize, as Jess has really illustrated so well, the impact that PTSD particularly can have, well, any mental health problem can have on the wider family, and the impact that has is really significant. So we try and put the person at the center of what we do, and then network around and look at a number of different options for them, which is the complexity of that slide. It shows what's out there, and for people negotiating their way around the healthcare system and the charities system, it can be quite daunting. Finding who to go to, who's the right person to go to, what's the right fit. So, key elements of the high-intensity service. The key elements of the high-intensity service is that we are a 7-day-a-week service with an out-of-hours element to it. We are mandated to respond within 24 to 36 hours of receiving a referral. So people aren't waiting 2 weeks, 5 weeks, months to get seen by a clinician. They will be seen within 24 to 36 hours. We're a pathfinder service. There are services across the United Kingdom. They vary in the way that they're actually put together. Ours is a clinically based service. My team are all clinical staff who have got military experience. The model we've gone for is one based on scaffolding. When we talk about scaffolding, when we talk about the model. The idea of that is that we want to work alongside existing services, to support existing services, to better work with the veteran population and their families. We don't want to take clinical responsibility away from where it should be, and that is within the locality NHS services that exist. There's a lot of expertise in that community, but they don't understand the nuances necessarily of working with the veteran community and their families. So provided what we try and do is to provide education, advice to existing services via our network. So we want to be working with ambulance services. Interestingly, we work quite closely with the prison service. As a slight aside, the prison population is veterans within the prison population are overrepresented. It's between 3 to 7% of the prison population nationally. Within the southwest, it's 10% of the prison population are ex-forces personnel. You can ask me afterwards why that's the case. There's some interesting data around that. So we're providing signposting, support, education, and training to our existing colleagues within social services and within health areas. Okay, the idea of the HIS service is that we work closely with the individual to provide support over a period of time. So, the high-intensity service is an element of the overall Courage. Courage, the name Courage was designed because that is the hardest thing to do, to make that first step, as Jess said, to take that first step and actually acknowledge and ask for that help is so difficult, and then to be consistently let down and have to tell your story again and again and again is so difficult for veterans. So the high-intensity service is an element that sits above the TILS, the Transition and Liaison Service, which is the first point of contact for people that are not in crisis. It sits above the complex treatment service, and the high-intensity model is based on dealing and supporting those members of the armed forces community, that's the veteran and their families, who are in crisis. Now, they may be in crisis because they've pitched up in an A&E department. They may be in crisis because they've just left the prison estate and don't know where to go. They may be in crisis because they're in an inpatient hospital unit. Or it may be that a crisis team have been alerted to them and we will be given the telephone call. The service, as I said, operates 7 days a week. It's a clinical service. Out of hours, after 6 o'clock at night, it switches over to a professionals advice line that is run by Combat Stress. And there is no answer phone these days, believe you me, because we're paying for the service. That's for clinicians that are picking up individuals that are in crisis to get advice and support over that night period so that we can then pick them up in the morning, get help to them, and get support to them. So, the impact of this. We will walk alongside an individual for as long as they need us to walk alongside them. Our clinical teams will speak to them daily, if necessary, meet with them as necessary, and ensure support to the family. We're a new team, we're developing, we're getting our feet on the ground. We cover the whole of the Southwest, that's 6 counties that we cover. But what we're doing is we're trying to ensure that people don't fall through the cracks, that they don't have to tell their story again and again and again. What we're doing is we're operating a case management model so we can take that person, we can get them into mainstream services that will be better prepared to give them the treatment that they need. But we'll also walk alongside those individuals for as long as it takes to ensure that that individual is in the care, under the care and in the treatment that they deserve and that they require. And equally provide the family with support, education around what it means to have somebody that's experiencing a significant mental illness. So part of what the team do is they stabilize the individual, they provide support to that family member, those families, and they work alongside clinicians in mainstream services to educate them to the nuances of working with the veteran population. Ostensibly, we're supposed to see people for a period of 6 to 15 weeks. However, what we've said within the service is people need to be within our service for longer than that. We will stay with them for as long as it takes. And if we have a hint that things are not going right, that they're being discharged by mainstream services, we will pick them straight up again, even if after the point where we've discharged them. Because that's the biggest thing for us. We do not want to see people fall through the cracks. We want to make sure that our colleagues that are experiencing that level of distress and their families are given a degree of hope and support and a faith in what we're doing, because that's one of the biggest things. Taking that first step of leap of faith in starting to talk about how you're feeling is the biggest thing, the biggest step of all. So this is a journey of one of the chaps that we've taken on. This lad had repeated hospital admissions under the Mental Health Act. He was homeless when we took him on. In a period of 18 months, he'd had 20-plus suicide attempts. He was estranged from his family. He was drinking. Mainstream services took him on and would discharge him too quickly. He was never well. He was discharged straight out after several weeks with really very little in the way of support and follow-up. And it wasn't because they didn't want to, it's just they didn't understand. Because, like us all, we present to the best of our possible ability when we go to see people. And that we don't necessarily talk about how we're actually feeling, because it's seen by some of us as being weak, and that the other people are worse off than us, and that I don't deserve this anyway. So we took him on. He was referred to our armed forces team here in Dorset. This is a separate team from the high-intensity services. This is an element of the service that we have here in Dorset, not the rest of the southwest, but this is an element we have here in Dorset that we'd like to replicate, where we would take people on for longer periods of time. We don't discharge people at all. They need to stay within the service, they stay within the service for as long as they need it. We have a welfare officer in the team who will look at benefits, we'll look at getting people into work, and we work alongside the charities, very closely with the charities, to make sure that people are given that level of support. The HIS team work closely with this team here in Dorset. We can transfer people straight in to the armed forces team. This lad we took on after a period of time. He's now been out of hospital for 2 years, hasn't had one suicide attempt. He's in stable accommodation, his own accommodation from being homeless. He's now back in contact with his family and is working towards establishing those relationships. He's working full-time, got a good job, is independent, and his mental health has improved no end. And the reason for that is because there's consistency of approach, there's faith in what we've been doing, and we've walked alongside that person all the way through that journey, through the mental health system. And we've been training and supporting mental health clinicians, working with him to better understand what it is to be a veteran, what it is to be a member of an armed forces family. And the point of this and the high-intensity service is to wrap around that individual and their family, to work with the charity sector, to work with statutory organisations, to ensure that what we're doing is going to benefit, and that people aren't having to tell their story over and over again and aren't being left in a void and aren't slipping through the cracks to be left to their own devices. I'm nearly finished. Those are some of the contact details. I want to finish on saying that actually this has been a real journey for us. We haven't always got it right, and we're learning it all the time. But we're committed as a service, as individuals within that service, to ensure that our colleagues working in mainstream services and the charity sector that we work with better understand the nuance of being a member of an armed forces family. We want to make sure that the Armed Forces Covenant is absolutely a live document. It isn't just a promise, that it's something that's actually real and that we can make real and continue to ensure is developed. That's me. Any questions? Okay, thank you very much for your attention.